There is a photograph of Hedy Lamarr taken in 1938, the year the world fell in love with her. She is standing on the MGM lot in Culver City, California, dressed in a white gown that catches the Southern California light. Her dark hair is swept back from her face with the kind of effortless perfection that studio photographers spent hours engineering, and her expression is one of absolute composure, serene, distant, untouchable. She has been in America for less than a year. She is 23 years old. She has already been a fugitive. The photographers called her the most beautiful woman in the world, and almost nobody questioned it. Louis B. Mayer himself had said so, and what Mayer declared, Hollywood printed. Within months of that photograph being taken, her face would appear on billboards across 48 states. Men would write letters to her by the thousands. Women would copy her hair, study her bone structure, attempt to replicate that quality of composed distance that seemed to exist just behind the eyes. Magazine editors ran out of superlatives. The public, exhausted by the depression and the approaching shadow of war in Europe, appeared content to simply be reassured that such a face existed. And yet, in the evenings, after the cameras went dark and the studio gates closed, Hedy Lamarr would return to her home in Beverly Hills, sit at the small workbench she had installed in a spare room, and work on something that had nothing to do with any of it. Schematics, equations, a theory about radio signals and torpedoes, and the synchronized movement of frequencies across a spectrum that no enemy could intercept, because no enemy could predict it. A theory that the United States Navy would not fully understand for another 20 years, and that would not be properly recognized in her lifetime as one of the foundational contributions to modern communications technology. Her story does not quite fit the shape of a triumph. It fits something older and more complex, and in the end more honest than that. The daughter of the bank director. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler on the 9th of November, 1914, in Vienna, Austria, a city that understood, perhaps better than any other in Europe, the precarious relationship between civilization and what lies just beneath it. Vienna, in 1914, was still the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, still the city of Freud and Klimt, of the great coffee houses and the concert halls, and the long philosophical arguments that seemed to be conducted everywhere simultaneously in drawing rooms, in university corridors, in the parks along the Ringstrasse. It was a city of extraordinary cultural wealth and extraordinary anxiety, a place aware, however dimly, that the world it had built was already beginning to crack at its foundations. The empire that gave Vienna its splendor would be dissolved by the time Hedwig Kiesler was 4 years old. The city she grew up in was a capital with no empire to govern, brilliant, diminished, and quietly haunted by the distance between what it had been and what it was becoming. Her father, Emil Kiesler, was a bank director, educated, thoughtful, and possessed of a quality that his only daughter would inherit in full and carry throughout her remarkable life: an insatiable, practical curiosity about how things worked. Emil Kiesler was not the kind of father who pointed at the world and told his child to admire it. He was the kind who stopped at the tram depot and explained the mechanics of the tracks, who walked her past a printing press and described, in careful language she could follow, the sequence of operations that turned metal type and ink and paper into a newspaper. From the time Hedwig could walk beside him steadily enough to keep pace, these were the walks he took her on long, unhurried circuits of Vienna's streets, in which the city became not a backdrop, but a text to be read and understood. She was 5 years old when she first disassembled her music box. She wanted to understand what was making the sound, and the only way to understand it properly was to see the mechanism. She took it apart with the careful attention of a child who has been taught that things repay close examination. She then, with equal care, put it back together again. It worked. She was pleased, but not particularly surprised. Understanding and doing had always seemed to her to be simply the same activity approached from different directions. Her mother, Gertrude, known to the family as Trude, was a Hungarian concert pianist from a family of considerable cultural standing. Trude had converted from Judaism to Catholicism and raised her daughter in the Christian faith, though the family's Jewish heritage was not something that could be erased by a change of religious practice and would not be forgotten by those who would later seek to use it against them. The household was comfortable, cultured, and genuinely loving a place where music was practiced seriously, and conversation was taken seriously, and a child who asked difficult questions was given difficult answers, or at the very least, the honest admission that the answer required more thought. Hedy Lamarr was, by all accounts, a child of pronounced contradictions. Exceptionally beautiful from an early age, she won a local beauty contest in Vienna at the age of 12, a fact that seems to have interested her less than almost anything else that happened to her that year, but equally drawn to the interior life of problems and mechanisms. She was something of a solitary child, more interested in the private satisfactions of figuring things out than in the social rituals of her peers. She read widely. She asked her father questions that he found, with evident pleasure, genuinely difficult to answer. At 16, she enrolled at the dramatic school run by the great director Max Reinhardt in Berlin, one of the most prestigious theatrical institutions in Europe, the training ground of some of the most significant performers of the 20th century. Reinhardt was not a man who accepted students out of politeness. He saw something in Hedy Lamarr beyond the considerable obvious, beyond the face and the bearing, and the quality of attention that made people look twice. He saw that she was genuinely intelligent, genuinely present, and genuinely capable of the kind of transformation that great acting requires. She was accepted without hesitation. Within a year of her arrival in Berlin, she had made her first screen appearance in a small German production called Geld auf der Straße, Money on the Street, in 1930. She was 16. It was a modest beginning, but the camera's relationship with her face was immediately apparent to anyone who looked through a viewfinder at her. There was something almost geometrically precise about how the lens responded to her features, the proportion, the stillness, the way she occupied space without apparent effort, as though existing beautifully was simply the resting state of her face, and the rest of us were, by comparison, in a condition of permanent aesthetic agitation. She continued working in German and Czechoslovakian productions through the early 1930s, building a professional reputation as a serious young actress with uncommon screen presence and a willingness to take on material that other actresses of her age and inexperience might have declined. In 1932, she appeared in a Czech film called X-Day's Ecstasy, directed by the Czech filmmaker Gustav Machati. The film was, by the standards of its era, a serious artistic work, a meditation on desire and disappointment that had real ambition behind it. It contained a scene in which Hedy Lamarr appeared briefly in the nude while swimming in a forest pool, and a second scene that Machati filmed in close-up, focusing on her face during a scene of intimacy that was considered at the time to be among the most frank depictions of female pleasure in the history of European cinema. X-Tace won a prize at the Venice Film Festival in 1922. It also generated a notoriety that Hedy Lamarr had neither sought nor particularly welcomed, and that would attach itself to her name in ways she found, for the rest of her life, both tiresome and reductive. She was 18 years old when the film was released. She was, by any professional measure, at the very beginning of something extraordinary. She was also, as events would very shortly prove, at the beginning of a trap she could not yet see clearly enough to avoid. The arms dealer. Friedrich Mandl was 33 years old in 1933 when he first became aware of Hedy Lamarr. He was, by the standards of his era and his world, a figure of considerable power. He headed Hirtenberger Patronenfabrik, one of the largest munitions manufacturers in Central Europe, an empire built on the reliable human appetite for destruction, which had proven, through 2 generations of the Mandl family's tenure, to be among the most stable of all industrial markets. He sold weapons to governments. He moved comfortably in the company of heads of state and military officials, and the kind of men who made decisions that appeared in history books decades later, usually in chapters with titles like The Origins of and The Road to. He was powerfully built, socially magnetic, and accustomed, by both temperament and experience, to acquiring whatever he decided he wanted. He decided he wanted Hedy Lamarr. He saw her in a Viennese stage production called Sissy, attended the performance not once but repeatedly, arranged an introduction through the social networks available to a man of his wealth and connections, and pursued her with the kind of focused, unhurried intensity that he applied to all his business dealings, The confidence of a man who has rarely been refused and has therefore never fully developed the inner resources required to process refusal gracefully. He was charming when it served him. He was generous in the way that very wealthy men are sometimes generous, which is to say that the generosity functioned as a statement of capacity rather than an expression of feeling. He could surround her with a life of almost absurd luxury, the palaces, the private trains, the shooting parties attended by prime ministers, the kind of existence that makes ordinary life, in retrospect, seem not merely modest but slightly unreal. He was also, as she would discover with increasing clarity over the 4 years that followed, a man who believed that ownership was a form of love, and that the person owned should be grateful for the security that ownership provided. They married on the 10th of August, 1933, at the Karlskirche in Vienna. She was 18 years old, he was 33. Her father, Emil, had died the year before she had lost him when she was 17, an event whose effect on her cannot be overstated, because Emil Kiesler had been the person in her life who took her mind seriously, who engaged with her curiosity as though it were a gift rather than an inconvenience, who had given her the fundamental working belief that the world rewarded people who paid attention to how it functioned. His death removed, at a stroke, the one person in her life who had fully understood what she was. The loss left her more vulnerable than she might otherwise have been to the shelter and the control that Friedrich Mandl seemed to offer. Mandl's social world was not a place that a Jewish girl with a film career, built partly on a controversial nude scene, could navigate easily or comfortably. He responded to this problem by making the question irrelevant. He simply forbade her from continuing her career. The stage, the screen, the professional life she had been building since she was 16, all of it was over, by his decree, the moment the wedding was concluded. He attempted, by all accounts with considerable financial commitment, to purchase and destroy every existing print of Extase. He did not succeed, but not for want of trying. He kept her close. She has described their home life, in her later writings and interviews, in terms that leave little ambiguity about its character. She was a virtual prisoner in their castle estate, Schloss Schwarzenau. She was required to be present at his business meetings and his social gatherings dressed immaculately, positioned correctly, available to smile on demand and make elegant conversation with whoever her husband required impressing. She was, in the vocabulary of her own later description, like a doll, a beautiful object to be displayed and guarded, a possession with a face. What Mandl had not calculated, and it is remarkable, in retrospect, how thoroughly he failed to calculate it was that the woman he had imprisoned was, behind the decorative surface, taking comprehensive mental notes. The business meetings at which Mandl's scientists and military contacts discussed the technical properties of guided torpedoes, the vulnerabilities of radio-controlled weaponry, the challenge of building systems resistant to enemy interference. These meetings were attended by his young wife, who sat quietly and appeared to be doing nothing more demanding than existing beautifully. In reality, she was listening with the focused attention of the woman who had once dismantled a music box at the age of 5 to understand what was making the sound. She absorbed the discussions about frequency and jamming and signal interception, the way she had absorbed her father's explanations of printing presses and trams, not passively, but actively, cross-referencing what she heard against what she already knew, and filing away the implications. Mandl had business ties to the Italian government and close connections to the Nazi regime in Germany, this despite the fact that his own father was Jewish, and Hedy's heritage was entirely so. The guests who attended the parties at the Mandl household included figures whose names would appear, within a few years, among the architects of the most catastrophic events of the 20th century. Hedy Kiesler sat among them, maintained her composure, and waited. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. The very experience that degraded her most profoundly those years as Friedrich Mandl's possession, those dinner-table educations in the science of warfare, would eventually prove to be the intellectual raw material from which one of the most significant inventions of the modern age was constructed. She paid an enormous personal cost for knowledge she never asked to acquire, in rooms she never wished to occupy, beside a man she was desperate to escape. History would eventually call it the foundation of her genius. She would have been entitled to call it something much less flattering. By 1937, she had formed a plan. The precise details have shifted across different tellings she has described at various points, disguising herself as a maid or gradually gaining freedom of movement by establishing that she could be trusted, or finding a moment of inattention in the household's surveillance of her. What is not disputed is the outcome. She left. She made her way to London. Behind her she left the castle, the jewels, the private trains, and a husband who would spend years trying to establish whether he could have her returned to him. She had taken nothing of obvious value. What she carried, invisible and entirely her own, was a thorough education in the applied science of modern warfare. In London, she engineered a meeting with Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM Studios, who was traveling through Europe in search of talent. His first offer, $125 a week, she declined, with the composed directness of a woman who had spent 4 years being underestimated and had developed, in consequence, a very precise sense of her own worth. She then identified which ocean liner he was traveling back to New York on, booked herself a passage, and spent the voyage impressing him so thoroughly with her presence and her intelligence that by the time the ship docked, she had a contract worth $500 a week. Mayer renamed her Hedy Lamarr, a name he chose himself, in tribute to the silent film star Barbara Lamarr, a great beauty who had died young, suggested by Mayer's wife, who had admired Lamarr greatly. It was, from the very beginning, a name borrowed from someone else's story, layered over the story of a woman who had, in escaping one man's control, arrived at another's. She reached Hollywood in 1938. The world that was waiting for her there did not know who she was. It knew only what she looked like. It would spend the next 20 years confusing the two. The sinking of the city of Benares. On the 17th of September, 1940, a German U-boat in the North Atlantic located a vessel called the SS City of Benares and fired. The ship was carrying 90 children evacuees sent from their families in Britain to the relative safety of Canada, away from the German bombing that had turned the cities of England into places where children no longer belonged. 77 of those children drowned. The rest of the passengers, crew and adult civilians also suffered catastrophic losses. The news reached the world within days and produced, even in people who had by that point already absorbed months of wartime horror, a specific quality of grief that attached itself to those 90 children and did not easily let go. Hedy Lamarr was in Hollywood when she read about it. She was, in the autumn of 1940, one of the most commercially successful film stars in America. Algiers had been a sensation in 1938, her first American film, opposite Charles Boyer, the role that had announced her to the country and to the world. Boomtown had opened that same year, alongside Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy, and had confirmed that she was not a one-film phenomenon but a genuine box office force. She was appearing regularly alongside the most celebrated actors of the era in the kinds of productions that the studio system built its prestige upon. She was earning money at a scale that would have been unimaginable to the girl who had grown up in Vienna, listening to her father explain the mechanism of a printing press. She was also, as she read about the children of the city of Benares, the woman who had sat at Friedrich Mandel's dinner tables for 4 years, listening to scientists discuss the vulnerabilities of radio-guided torpedoes. She had not forgotten a word of it. She had, if anything, spent the intervening years thinking about it more carefully, in the private hours when the studio day was over, and she could sit at the workbench in her spare room with pen and paper, and the kind of concentrated quiet that her public life never permitted. The children were the reason she decided that thinking was no longer sufficient. She had already been introduced, at a dinner party earlier that year, to a musician named George Antheil. Antheil was a New Jersey native who had spent the 1920s in Paris, building a reputation as one of the most genuinely unconventional composers of the era. A man whose ballet mécanique had used 16-player pianos, operated simultaneously and synchronized by a single mechanical timer as an orchestral ensemble. The piece had caused a considerable scandal at its premiere, which Antheil had regarded with undisguised satisfaction. He was clever, argumentative, interested in practical engineering in the way that certain artists are when they have also, privately and without much acknowledgement, been thinking like scientists all along. He wrote a syndicated column, offering advice on matters including endocrinology and human behavior. which gives some indication of the range of his interests. He and Lamarr had recognized in each other, at that dinner party, a quality of mind that they rarely encountered in their respective professional worlds. That autumn, in the weeks after the city of Benares' sinking, Lamarr reached out to Anthiel and told him what she had been thinking about. The problem, as she understood it from those years of education in the Mandel household, was precise. Radio-guided torpedoes could be jammed. If an enemy could identify the frequency on which a torpedo's guidance signal was being transmitted, they could broadcast interference on that same frequency and send the torpedo off course. The solution, in theory, was elegant. Make the frequency unpredictable. If the transmitter and the receiver changed frequency simultaneously jumping, in perfect synchronization, through an agreed but apparently random sequence, then any jammer who locked onto one frequency would find that the signal had already moved. There would be nothing to jam. The torpedo would find its target. The technical challenge was synchronization. How did you ensure that both ends of the transmission changed frequencies at the same moment, in the same sequence, without communicating the pattern through a channel that could itself be intercepted? This was where Anthiel's peculiar expertise became, unexpectedly, exactly what was needed. He had spent years working out how to synchronize multiple-player pianos, how to program each instrument with the same punched paper roll so that they moved through identical sequences at identical moments, with no direct communication between them and no conductor to keep them together. The synchronization was entirely mechanical, entirely self-contained, and entirely reliable. The same principle, they both understood immediately, could be applied to a radio transmitter and its receiver. Each would carry the same sequence, the equivalent of the punched paper roll, and would change frequencies together in perfect lockstep, without broadcasting the pattern to anyone who might intercept it. They worked on the problem through the winter and into the following year, meeting at Lamarr's home, filling pages with calculations, refining the mechanism, addressing the practical objections that arose, and finding ways around them. Anthiel brought his technical knowledge of synchronization. Lamarr brought her understanding of torpedo guidance systems and radio technology, acquired in rooms she had never wished to occupy. Together they produced something that neither could have produced alone. On the 10th of June, 1941, they filed a patent application with the United States Patent Office for what they called a secret communication system. Lamarr filed under her then legal name, Hedy Lamarr. She had married, briefly, the screenwriter Jean Markey, and used his surname on the document. On the 11th of August, 1942, United States Patent number 2,292,387 was granted. The patent described, in careful and specific technical language, the system of frequency hopping spread spectrum communication that the two of them had developed together in the evenings of a Hollywood winter. Lamarr offered the patent to the National Inventors Council and suggested it be used by the United States Navy for the guidance of torpedoes. The Navy's response was, in essence, that the technology was theoretically interesting but practically impossible to implement with the miniaturization technology then available. The mechanism they had proposed was simply too large to fit inside a torpedo with the components that existed in 1942. The patent was filed away. Because Lamarr had donated it to the war effort, she received no licensing fees and no compensation. The invention was, by the standards of the time, classified, which meant that even the modest public acknowledgement that a civilian inventor might have received was denied to her. The patent would run for 17 years and expire in 1959, the year George Anthiel died, without ever having generated a single cent of income for either of its creators. She had given them the architecture of the future, clearly drawn, clearly explained, and correctly labelled. They had looked at it, determined that they could not use it yet, and put it in a drawer. And from that moment, the life that Hedy Lamarr had built everything that had come before, the escape from Vienna, the reinvention in Hollywood, the years of careful private work at the spare room workbench would be measured differently by history than it was by her own time and by the people who shared it with her. The long cost. The years that followed the patent were, in their external appearance, years of continued and considerable success. The films kept arriving, and the public kept coming. In 1942, she appeared in White Cargo, a production that became one of the year's most commercially successful pictures. In 1943, she starred in The Heavenly Body and continued to sell war bonds with a commitment that went beyond mere patriotic duty. She genuinely understood, better than almost anyone in Hollywood, what the war was about and what was at stake in it. She had, after all, sat in rooms with the men who started it. In 1944, she took a step that was highly unusual for an actress of her era and status. She founded her own production company. Mars Film Corporation represented an attempt to take control of the kinds of roles she was offered and the kinds of stories she was permitted to tell, to move beyond the exotic seductress, the dangerous beauty, the decorative foreigner with the unplaceable accent, and into material that engaged with her as a complete person rather than a surface. She produced and starred in The Strange Woman in 1946 and Dishonored Lady in 1947, with mixed critical results, but with the satisfaction of having made decisions that were her own. And then came Samson and Delilah in 1949, directed by Cecil B. DeMille, and everything changed again. The film became the most commercially successful picture Paramount had released up to that point. Lamarr's portrayal of Delilah, composed, morally complex, entirely in command of a character who is both villain and victim, simultaneously reminded critics and audiences, who had perhaps begun to take her for granted, that she was not simply a beautiful woman performing in films, but an actress of genuine and sustained ability. The film ran for over a year in many cinemas. British filmgoers voted her the 10th Best Actress of the Year. She was 34 years old, and at what appeared to be the peak of her powers. But beneath the visible success, the private costs were accumulating in ways that the public image concealed almost entirely. The marriages tell part of the story. 6 of them, across the span of her life: Friedrich Mandel, Jean Markey, John Loder, Teddy Stauffer, W. Howard Lee, and Louis Boys. With John Loder, her third husband, she had her 3 children, James, Denise, and Anthony. Each marriage ended in divorce, and the pattern across them is one of a woman of exceptional intelligence and independence who was, repeatedly, either sought for the wrong reasons or paired with men who were fundamentally unable to meet her where she actually lived, in the part of her that was not the face, not the screen presence, not the most beautiful woman in the world, but the woman who wanted to talk about mechanisms and systems and the engineering of things that mattered. She was, in the way of all remarkable people who are defined publicly by a single attribute, and in her case, the attribute was physical beauty, profoundly lonely in a specific way. Not without company. She was rarely without company. Lonely in the more exacting sense, without the sustained understanding of another person who grasped the whole of her rather than the most visible part. Howard Hughes had come closest, in many ways. He had lent her equipment for her trailer on set. He had taken her to his airplane factories and introduced her to the engineers. He had treated her scientific curiosity not as an amusing quirk, but as a genuine capacity worthy of engagement. He was also, as anyone who knew Howard Hughes will confirm, a man whose own complexity made sustained closeness with him essentially impossible. The studio system itself had cast her, from the very beginning, in a role that was not very different from the one Friedrich Mandel had assigned her. She was a beautiful object to be displayed. Her intelligence was, if not exactly suppressed, certainly not invited in. The roles she was offered were almost uniformly variations on the same note: the exotic, the dangerous, the beautiful foreigner. She fought against it, repeatedly, with limited success. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. While Hedy Lamarr was playing the most beautiful woman in the world for the benefit of the studio system, the technology she had invented with George Antheil was beginning, quietly and without any credit to either of them, to enter the practical world. The United States Navy had used frequency hopping technology during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1,962 inches torpedo guidance systems that bore an unmistakable family resemblance to patent number 229,2387. The patent itself had expired 3 years earlier, in 1959, without acknowledgement, without compensation, and without so much as a letter of thanks from any of the institutions that had benefited from the thinking it contained. By the time the patent expired, Hedy Lamarr's film career was already over. Her final major film, The Female Animal, was released in 1958. She was 43 years old. The industry that had used her face for 20 years had moved on to other faces, as it always had and always would, with the institutional indifference of a system that mistakes the temporary for the essential, and the essential for the temporary. She had given them 20 years of her face and 17 years of her best idea. She had received, in return, a reasonable amount of money, 6 marriages that had not endured, and an absence of recognition that would not be addressed for another 4 decades. The reckoning arrives. For 3 decades after her final film, Hedy Lamarr existed in a kind of liminal space, too famous to be entirely forgotten, too absent from the cultural conversation to be properly remembered or reassessed. The world knew her face from the films. It did not know her mind. A younger generation knew the name primarily as a punchline. Mel Brooks had used a character called Hedy Lamarr in his 1974 Western comedy, Blazing Saddles, a joke at the expense of the name, which Lamarr had found sufficiently offensive to pursue in court. She did not win. It was, in its way, representative of the period, her legacy being used for purposes she had not authorized, in contexts she found demeaning, without the recourse or the recognition that she deserved. But by the late 1980s, something was beginning to shift, not quickly, not loudly, but with the slow, unmistakable quality of a fact that has been waiting patiently for the world to catch up with it. The technology that she and George Antheil had patented in 1942 was finally being understood by the people who worked with it daily for what it actually was. Frequency hopping spread spectrum communication, the principle of synchronized, unpredictable frequency changes that prevented interception or jamming, had become foundational to the architecture of modern wireless communication. It was present in the military systems that had been developed through the Cold War. It was about to become present, at a scale that dwarfed anything they could have imagined in 1940, in the commercial wireless technology that was beginning to reshape the everyday world: mobile telephones, wireless local area networks, the systems that would eventually be called Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and GPS. All of them, the entire wireless revolution that the last decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st would produce, were built upon a principle whose origins lay in a spare room in Beverly Hills and 2 remarkable minds working quietly against the backdrop of a world at war. A handful of engineers and historians of technology began, independently, to trace the lineage. Papers appeared in technical journals. The story circulated, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, in publications that were read by people who understood what they were reading. In 1985, the United States Federal Communications Commission had approved spread spectrum technology for commercial use, a decision that would, within a decade, transform the world. The people who built the systems knew where the idea had come from. Dave Hughes, a technology writer, and Kleinrock, among others, began to draw public attention to the connection between Lamarr's 1942 patent and the wireless technology that was emerging. In 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the organization dedicated to defending civil liberties in the digital world, made the decision to award Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil their Pioneer Award. Antheil had been dead for 38 years. The award for him was posthumous. Lamarr was 82 years old and living alone in Florida, in a condominium in the suburbs of Orlando, a place that could not have been further in any meaningful sense from the world in which the work being honored had been done. She accepted the award by telephone. She did not attend the ceremony. She no longer wished to be seen in public, and she had her reasons, which she kept to herself with the same composed privacy that had characterized her throughout her life. Those who spoke with her by phone in this period described a voice that was still immediately, unmistakably hers. The Viennese accent intact after 60 years in America, the delivery precise and unhurried, the intelligence present in every sentence. She was not sentimental. She was not effusive. She received the acknowledgement with the quiet directness of someone who has been waiting for it for a very long time and has, in the waiting, moved somewhat beyond the need for it, though not entirely beyond the satisfaction of its arrival. When she was asked, in a brief statement following the award, what she wished to say about the recognition, she offered 3 words: "It's about time." That same year, 1997, She became the first woman to receive the Invention Convention's Bulby-Gnass Spirit of Achievement Award, described with some justification as the Oscars of inventing, given to individuals whose creative achievements across their lifetimes have significantly contributed to society. The award placed her, formally and publicly, in the company of the great inventive minds of the century. In 1998, she received the Victor Kaplan Medal from the Austrian Association of Patent Holders and Inventors recognition from her homeland, the country that had shaped her and then lost her, for work it had taken 56 years to properly acknowledge. The story was spreading beyond the technical world and into the general public. Articles appeared in mainstream publications, the BBC commissioned profiles, the documentary Bombshell, the Hedy Lamarr story, which would eventually provide the most comprehensive public account of her dual life, was in the early stages of development. A street in Vienna, the Hedy Lamarr Weg, in the 12th district of Meidling, would eventually be named in her honour. She was, in these years, genuinely pleased, not transformed by it, not restored to the public life she had left behind. She was 82, and the choices she had made about privacy were firm, considered, and her own. But pleased. The work had been real. It had mattered. The world had, eventually, noticed. It was, in its quiet and long-delayed way, the curtain call she had earned. Not the kind she had received at film premieres in the 1940s, the flowers and the flashbulbs, and the studio machinery of approval, which had always been directed at the surface of her. The other kind. The kind that arrives when enough time has passed to separate what was temporary from what was not, and to see, clearly and without distortion, what actually endured. The final years. Hedy Lamarr's final years were spent in Castleberry, Florida, a quiet suburb north of Orlando, the kind of place where the architecture is modest and the pace is slow, and the famous dead of Hollywood's golden age do not typically come to rest. She lived alone. She did not drive. She was, by the end, legally blind, a condition that had required ongoing treatment and that had contributed, along with other factors, to her withdrawal from public life. The world reached her by telephone, mostly the same medium through which she had received her greatest honor, and she was selective about who she spoke to and what she said. The plastic surgeries were a private grief that she rarely discussed directly. Over the years since her film career ended, she had undergone a series of operations that had not, by her own later assessment, produced the results she had wanted, and that had altered her appearance in ways that she found distressing enough to make the prospect of being seen in public genuinely painful. For a woman whose face had been the most photographed in the world, the experience of no longer being able to look in a mirror and recognize what she saw there was, by any measure, a particular kind of difficulty, one that intersected, in complicated ways, with everything the world had always told her about where her value resided. She had been a recluse, in the meaningful sense, since the 1960s. The decade had not been kind to her. In 1966, she had been arrested in a Los Angeles department store on shoplifting charges, accused of taking $86 worth of merchandise. The charges were eventually dropped, but the publicity had been the kind that attaches to former celebrities in diminished circumstances and contains within it a particular quality of cruelty, the implication that here is what becomes of glamour. She had found the experience mortifying. She sued the ghostwriters of her 1966 autobiography, Ecstasy and Me, calling it false and salacious. She lost. She retired further from view. In August of 1991, history repeated itself with an almost unbearable specificity. She was arrested again, this time at an Eckerd drugstore in Castleberry, Florida, accused of shoplifting $21.48 worth of personal care items, laxatives and eye drops. She was 76 years old and legally blind. She had come to the drugstore with a friend to purchase items she legitimately needed. The precise sequence of events that led to her being stopped by the store manager and subsequently charged is recounted with various degrees of sympathy in different accounts, but the outcome is not in dispute. She was taken to the police station, charged with a misdemeanor, and driven home afterwards by a young officer who was 24 years old and had no idea who she was. She provided her signature on the court notice when they reached her condominium. He was, those who know the story have always noted, kind to her. She was eventually cleared of the charge. Her attorney demonstrated that she was legally blind and had been undergoing ongoing treatment for her eyes, the very reason she needed the eye drops that she had been accused of stealing. The case was dismissed. But the photographs had already been taken, and the headlines had already been written. For many people of the generation that came of age after her films, it was the first time they had encountered her name. Former film queen, most beautiful woman in the world, charged with stealing laxatives from a Florida drugstore. The gap between those two realities was the measure of everything that the world had failed to understand about who she actually was, everything it had chosen not to see. For more than 50 years, because looking at the surface had always seemed sufficient. Her son Anthony maintained a relationship with her in these years, and those who knew her through him or through the telephone conversations that some of her interlocutors preserved have described a woman who was, beneath the isolation and the accumulated difficulties, still entirely herself, still direct, still intellectually alive, still possessed of the quality of focused, impatient intelligence that had always been the most consistent thing about her, more consistent than the beauty, more consistent than the marriages, more consistent than the roles the studio system had assigned her. The mind that had dismantled the music box at 5 years old was still working. It had simply run out of rooms to work in. She died on the 19th of January, 2000, at her home in Castleberry, Florida, from heart disease. She was 85 years old. The news was reported widely, and with a warmth that she might have found had she been able to read it. Somewhat ironic, the recognition that had been so long deferred arriving, with some generosity, in her obituaries. The documentary that would tell her story most fully, Bombshell, the Hedy Lamarr story, would not be released until 2017. She was inducted posthumously into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2014. Her son Anthony arranged for her ashes to be scattered in the Vienna woods, the forested hills that rise above the city on its western edge, where she had walked as a child beside her father, listening to him explain how things worked. She had asked for that, specifically. It seems right that she asked for the beginning, what remains, and return now to that photograph from 1938, the white gown, the MGM lot in Culver City, the Southern California light, the expression of composed, serene, perfect distance. The woman who has been in America for less than a year. We know, now, what we did not know then, or rather, what was always knowable but that the world had decided it did not need to know, because the surface was so thoroughly satisfying that the interior seemed an unnecessary complication. We know that behind the expression the publicists called mystery, there was a mind in the process of converting everything she had survived, the dead father, the controlling husband, the dinner tables full of arms dealers and generals, the years spent as the most beautiful object in the room, into something that would outlast all of it. We know that she was not, even in that moment of perfect glamour, only what the photograph contained. The irony at the center of Hedy Lamarr's life is the kind that history takes a very long time to produce, and that requires, when it finally arrives, a particular quality of stillness to appreciate fully. The very experience that imprisoned her most completely, the marriage to Friedrich Mandl, the 4 years spent silent and attentive at the arms dealer's table, was the source material from which the invention was built. She could not have conceived the secret communication system without those years of enforced education in the science of weapons, guidance, and radio technology. She did not want to have spent those years. She was desperate to escape them, and eventually did. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the space between them is where her actual story lives. She was erased. In her own lifetime, in both of the worlds she inhabited, Hollywood erased her mind. The military establishment erased her contribution. She was too beautiful for anyone to imagine she was serious, and too female and too foreign for anyone to fully credit the possibility that she was right. The patent expired unrewarded. The marriages dissolved. The films aged into archive. The children of the wireless age grew up holding devices that functioned on a principle she had described in careful technical language in 1941 and 1942, and the vast majority of them had no idea. They knew her face, if they knew her at all. They did not know what she had done. Every mobile telephone that has ever been made, every Wi-Fi network, every Bluetooth connection, every GPS system, Every one of the wireless communications technologies that now structure the daily lives of billions of people on Earth carries, in its fundamental architecture, the trace of an idea that originated in a spare room in Beverly Hills, in the mind of a woman who had escaped from an Austrian castle with nothing but her memories and her intelligence. She was not credited during her professional lifetime. She was not compensated. She was not consulted. The Navy built the future on her blueprint and did not send a letter. And yet she lasted. The ashes in the Vienna woods. The Pioneer Award accepted by telephone from Florida at 82, with 3 words that contained everything. It's about time. The street in Vienna that carries her name now, in the district where she grew up, in the city where her father once walked her past the trams and the printing presses and explained, patiently and with evident pleasure, how things worked. The extraordinary final irony is this. In a life that was defined, publicly and persistently, by physical beauty, a quality that is temporary by its very nature, that diminishes with time and cannot be preserved, what she actually left behind was a form of contribution that belongs to the permanent category. The face that the cameras loved is in photographs now, fixed and unchanging and still, after all these years, remarkable. But the invention is not in photographs. The invention is in the air itself, in the invisible signals that pass, at this moment, through every room in every building in the world, frequency hopping in unpredictable patterns that no enemy can jam and no interceptor can follow, exactly as she designed them. She built something into the fabric of the world. She did it quietly, in the evenings, at a workbench nobody photographed. She did it because she was paying attention in rooms where nobody expected her to be paying attention, and because the mind that had dismantled a music box at the age of 5 had never stopped wanting to understand how things worked, regardless of what the world decided to see when it looked at her. What does the photograph from 1938 tell us, now that we know everything? It tells us that the most significant thing in the picture is not what the photographer was pointing at. It tells us that the surface of a life, however brilliant, is almost never the whole of it. It tells us that the woman who appears to be simply standing still, serene, composed, untouchable in her white gown on the MGM lot is, if you know how to look, already working on something you will not understand for another 50 years. Hedy Lamarr was remarkable. She was also, in the way of all truly remarkable people, more than one thing at once. And the world's insistence on reducing her to the most visible of those things is not a reflection of her limitation, but of ours. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.